part one on a series concerned with The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. You're doing a series of criticisms, essays, and a little bit of a biographical background. Biographical and Historical Context. Polish, not English, was the language Joseph Conrad grew up speaking. English wasn't even his second language. French was. The fact that Conrad achieved fame in his third language is testimony to his genius. Genius that could be contained neither by linguistic barriers nor by national boundaries. Early political persecution and exile failed to stifle it. Even the loss of family and deep personal unhappiness could only restrain it temporarily. Conrad was christened Joseph Conrad. Nelitz Korzeniowski. Both his mother, Ewa, and his father, Apollo, were descended from wealthy Polish families. Born in 1857, in the 85th year of Muscovite oppression, as his father put it, Joseph found himself from childhood on a person without a country. In 1772, Poland had been divided up among Russia, Prussia, and Austria, only to be redivided in 1793 and 1795. Thus, although Conrad was born into the landed gentry of Polish culture, in what had become Western Russian province, his childhood years were full of uncertainty. His headstrong, talented father, a poet and translator of French and English literature, was dedicated to the cause of Polish independence from Russia. Just before a Polish uprising was quelled in 1863, Apollo was arrested and exiled to the village of Vologda, hundreds of miles north of Moscow. The trip to Vologda nearly killed young Joseph, and the brutal winters there hastened the demise of both his parents. Ewa died of tuberculosis in 1865, her despairing husband shortly thereafter, in 1869. Joseph, who was but 12 years old, was adopted by his mother's uncle, and at once firm but indulgent gentleman named Tadeusz Bobrowski. Uncle Tadeusz cared well for his orphan nephew, sending him first to school in Krakow, later to Geneva with a tutor. But the young Conrad could adjust neither to the rigors of school life nor the personal attentions of his private teacher, who continually tried to reform his pupil's romantic views on life and the world. Finally, the exasperated Joseph persuaded his uncle Tadeusz to let him join the French merchant navy. The 4 years following were more adventure-filled, but apparently no more satisfying than the earlier teenage years. Conrad sailed to the West Indies and Venezuela, squandered a small fortune, lost in love, got involved in a gun-running venture for the Carlists, who were seeking to seize the throne of Spain for Carlos de Bourbon, and attempted suicide in 1878. That same year, French immigration authorities prevented him from continuing as a sailor on a merchant marine vessel. This last turn of events seemed in the long run to have been a fortunate one, since Conrad was to sail for the next 16 years on British ships and to become a British subject in 1887. Conrad's metamorphosis from a French sailor to an English one caused him to master the language in which he would ultimately choose to write his novels. The greatest of these, including Heart of Darkness, Lord Jim, Nostromo, The Secret Agent, and Victory, have been, almost since their publication, ranked with the most powerful and poetic novels ever written in English. Like other geniuses, Conrad had a way of turning disadvantage into advantage. He made unconventional poetic use of a language he was forced to master by circumstance. A lesser talent would have been blunted by 20 trying years of life on deck. Conrad transformed his experiences into art. From his years in the East and West Indies, he gained the atmosphere as well as the insights into human nature that he was to draw upon while writing books from Almayer's Folly, published in 1895, when Conrad was in his 30s, to The Rescue, published in 1920, 4 years before Conrad's death. But it was not only in the East and West Indies that Conrad came by the store of experiences that were later to be metamorphosized into art. Indeed, the voyage that seems to have the greatest impact on Conrad's life and art was not by sea at all, or at least the most memorable part of the trip was not. That was the expedition that saw Conrad far up the Congo River on a rusty steamboat with a shrill whistle. Conrad had begun writing Almayer's Folly, his first novel, in 1889, just before commencing the trip up to Stanley, now Boyoma Falls, in 1890. In spite of the near torturous nature of the journey, he managed to make continual progress on the book while en route. The trip from Boma to Stanley Falls and back was one of the last Conrad ever made as a sailor. It marked, in a sense, the beginning of a brief but crucial period of his life, a period that came to an end in 1894, the year his beloved uncle, Tadeusz, died. For it was then that Conrad decided to devote himself to writing full-time. Shortly after making that decision, he was to marry Jessie George, the troubled Pole without a clear-cut family nationality. Language, love, or even calling in life was now Joseph Conrad, a British subject, husband, and writer. Present-day Zaire, one of the largest nations in Africa, was known as the Belgian Congo from 1908 until 1960. When it gained its independence, the Congo visited by Conrad, and by the narrator of Heart of Darkness, was officially called L'État indépendant du Congo. Commemorarily, if roughly translated into English as the Congo Free State. But Belgian, the Congo, was from 1885 on, thanks to a conference called in Berlin in 1884 by Otto von Bismarck, first Chancellor of the newly formed German Empire. Not that Belgium had opened up the Congo to European exploration, exploitation, and development. The celebrated Scot, Dr. David Livingstone, had gone there in 1856 to be found by the Americanized Welshman Henry Morton Stanley in 1871. Livingstone and Stanley, moreover, had been preceded by Portuguese, Dutch, and French pioneers. In fact, until 1876, King Leopold II of Belgium had merely sat back and watched with interest. In that year, though, this ambitious and notoriously immoral monarch of a nation less than 50 years old made his first move. He organized a meeting in Brussels to discuss a plan to open to civilization the only part of our globe where Christianity has not yet penetrated, and to pierce the darkness which envelops the entire population. Hennessy 13. Bismarck, who had gradually come to realize that no nation would win anything if all were drawn into a territorial, theological, or trade war, eventually called his own conference in Berlin. To the surprise of astute political forecasters throughout the Western world, Bismarck's 1884 convention resulted in a decision to make the Congo the personal property of Leopold II. All the king had to do was guarantee that all nations would be permitted to trade freely there, that taxes and tariffs would not be collected, and that nations would not be granted monopolies on particular items of trade. Leopold, who ended up shirking most of his commitments, controlled the Congo until he died in 1908. In a will written in 1889, he bequeathed the territory to Belgium in exchange for a government loan of 150 million francs. Thus the Congo had been all but Belgian since long before 1908. And it had been ruled by a tyrant whose promise to bring civilization to Africa had turned out to be little more than a cruel joke. Leopold had divided the country into 16 districts, each governed by a commissioner, who rendered the local chiefs impotent. Some of these officials went on to build personal fortunes by collecting taxes from the natives. And since few of the natives had anything to give but their labor, the commissioners were in effect slaveholders, and the Congolese were slaves in all but name. Leopold, in turn, received a portion of all profits made by his administrators, so it was in his interest to make sure that when Africans rebelled against the sentries who guarded them while they worked out their taxes, they be taught a swift and brutal lesson. Reports of atrocities were drifting back to Europe within a few years after Leopold had been granted proprietorship. Baptist missionaries, duped by the king's stated goal of Christianizing the Congo, were among the first to cry foul. But the Congo was far from Europe, and the damning reports from scattered missionaries were relatively few and far between. And anyway, people wondered, in Europe, wasn't it inevitable that the lives of some Africans would be lost? When natives rebelled, weren't the sentries merely protecting themselves, or at worst doing their duty? King Leopold assured his people that their agents were profoundly reluctant to use force. However, he explained unfortunate incidents were bound to happen, since many of the sentries were wretched Negroes with sanguinary habits, recruited from the local population, natives who were, in other words, prone to turn viciously on their own people. Burroughs, 286. Many of the station managers and traders that Leopold refers to as his agents were drawn from the ranks of the Belgian army, and by 1890 they had, with Leopold's blessing, given the lie to their king's promise that the Congo would be a free trade territory. Ivory, the most valuable commodity, had become a Belgian monopoly. Non-Belgian traders caught carrying it could be summarily shot, either by Leopold's army-trained representatives or by their sentries. Among these sentries were natives, freed from their black slave owners and offered protection by the white invaders. They had to work 7 years for their new master, whether he chose to send them or whatever wages he sought to bestow, and in whatever conditions he saw fit to provide. Why did Conrad go to such a place? Since the mid-1870s, he had been sailing the high seas mainly on English ships. Why would he want to ride a leaky Belgian steamboat upriver into the troubled heart of Africa, when the open seas led to a whole world of places whose names surely conjured up more images of romance and adventure? Part of the answer can perhaps be found in Conrad's late essay, Geography and Some Explorers, in which he recalls that, as an adolescent, he had been particularly fascinated by stories of polar explorers, of Leopold McClintock's book, The Voyage of the Fox in the Arctic Seas, 1859. Conrad writes, There could hardly have been imagined a better book for letting in the breath of the stern romance of polar exploration. The great spirit of the realities of the story sent me off on a romantic explorations of my inner self. Geography 16 to 17. Another complimentary explanation of why Conrad wanted to visit King Leopold's troubled Congo may lie in the same essay, in the paragraphs that tell of a lifelong fascination with maps. By age 13, he recalls he was addicted to map gazing, much as other people became hooked on stargazing. And it was Africa, Conrad writes, the continent out of which the Romans used to say some new thing was always coming, that seemed particularly fascinating. So much of that continent was unknown and unexplored that maps of the whole region of it would be covered by exciting spaces of white paper. Thus, owing to its regions unknown, the heart of Africa, as represented by maps, was white and big. Geography 19 to 20. At about the age of 16, Conrad made a public commitment to travel someday to unknown Africa. One day, he recalls, putting my finger on a spot in the very middle of the then white heart of Africa, I declared that someday I would go there. Geography 24. Long before he was 16, and even before he read The Voyage of the Fox in the Arctic Seas, though Conrad had expressed his intention to do what he finally did in 1890 on the steamer Roi de Belgies, in his late autobiographical retrospective entitled Some Reminiscences, Conrad claims that the decision was made during childhood. It was in 1868, when I was 9 years old or thereabouts, that while looking at a map of Africa of the time and putting my finger on the blank space then representing the unsolved mystery of the continent, I said to myself with absolute assurance and an amazing audacity which is no longer in my character now, when I grow up, I shall go there. 41. Conrad then says he gave the proclamation no further thought until more than 20 years later. The opportunity to travel up the Congo River to Stanley Falls actually presented itself. For Stanley Falls was the very spot on the map he had pointed at in 1868. The blankest of blank spaces on the Earth's figured surface. Reminiscences 41. These various personal records suggest that Conrad decided to go to the Congo for several closely related reasons, in part because the interior of Africa had been represented by cartographers as a mysterious white blankness, and in part because tales of polar exploration had been equated white blankness with the unknown and explorers of the white wilderness with true heroism. Conrad associated the Congo with the unknown and equated a long voyage there with the most important heroic kind of voyage. Tales of seamen wandering the South Pacific were tales of the acquisitive spirit of those urged on by the desire of trade or loot, whereas the aims of the polar explorers were as pure as the air of those high latitudes. Geography 14. If mere stories of such men sent Conrad off on explorations of his inner self, how much more he was likely to learn about his own nature and human nature in general by traveling into the great expanse of white that lay beyond the colored mapped areas of Africa. There is an obvious irony to Conrad's implicit association of the unknown Congo, hot and humid home of a dark race, with whiteness and the Arctic. Another irony emerges as we read Conrad's novel set in the Congo. The aims of several white explorers portrayed in it were morally black as pitch, not at all like the pure aims of Arctic wayfarers in search of the Northwest Passage. So obvious are these ironies that they were obviously intended. Still, we must remember that the Conrad who wrote not Heart of Whiteness, but rather Heart of Darkness, the Conrad who still later penned some reminiscences and the essay on maps and explorers, was an older and wiser Conrad than the young man who set sail from France on the 6th of May, 1890, for the Congolese coast. Conrad could not have known until he actually experienced the Congo just how much its explorers were prompted by the desire for loot. The Congo was supposed to be a relatively free, peaceful state, open to all traders, and therefore free not only of the murderous violence, but also of the slavery found in so many other areas of the world. Conrad had to discover personally just how false that supposition was, in seeing how easily Europeans who set forth in ships to enlighten and civilize can corrupt and destroy. Conrad came to a profound realization about human nature. Whiteness and light may turn out to be blackness and darkness darkness may be relatively pure. In learning that hard lesson, Conrad also discovered something profound about himself, that it was as a writer, not as a merchant sailor, that he wanted to explore the world, especially the inner world of civilized humanity. Footnote: Frederick Carl develops this idea in Joseph Conrad, The Three Lives, New York, Farfar, 1979. I am indebted to Carl not only for this idea, but also for bringing together illuminating excerpts from Conrad's letters and diary, some of which are quoted below. End of footnote. Thus, even though Conrad could not have been prepared to find what he found in the Congo by white spaces on a map, tales of polar exploration or accounts of the Congo Free State that amounted to King's whitewash, he did, in a sense, find in the Congo exactly what, as a schoolboy, he had somehow sensed he would find: the mysterious unknown, self-knowledge, and even, it seems fair to say, his destiny. There were, of course, practical reasons why Conrad decided to go to the Congo. Fated though it seems he was by the promise he had made in childhood to go there, drawn as he was to the idea of discovering something about himself while voyaging into uncharted territory. Conrad was also attracted to the Congo because it promised a much-needed source of financial support. Conrad had used up his inheritance by the age of 21, and because there it seemed he was not just a sailor, but a captain. He had briefly served as master of the Australian vessel, but it was not until 1886 that he passed the examination qualifying him for a commission certified by the British Board of Trade. In 1889, Conrad approached Albert Theiss, managing director of the Société Anonyme Belge pour le Commerce du Haut-Congo, in the hope that Theiss would procure him a position commanding a steamer plying the Congo River. But Conrad also looked into other positions that, had they materialized, would have sent him back to the West Indies as a captain. Neither destination beckoned immediately. Theiss had nothing to offer, perhaps because Conrad wanted a long-term commitment. A short visit would not be worth the trouble and expense of leaving Europe, for, he remarked to Theiss in a letter dated December 27, 1889, Carl, 276 in brackets. With no immediate prospects, Conrad decided to visit Uncle Tadeusz in Ukraine, then to return to England by way of Brussels, where he hoped not only to reassert his interest in a Congo command, but also to visit with his aunt Marguerite and uncle Alexander Porodowska. Uncle Alexander was actually Conrad's cousin. Aunt Marguerite, a writer of novels and short stories, was related to Conrad only by marriage. Hearing that Alexander was ill and failing fast, Conrad changed his plans and went to Brussels first. He arrived on February 5th, 1890. 2 days later, his cousin died. Although Conrad was soon to enter a close relationship and correspondence with Marguerite, he left her before her husband was buried, traveling to Warsaw, then to Lublin, and finally to Kazimierza, where he stayed with Uncle Tadeusz for 2 months. In spite of Tadeusz's attempt to discourage him from his interest in a Congo command, Conrad returned to Brussels on April 26, 1890. There he learned that a steamer captain named Frieselben had died in the Congo and that a command was available. Actually, Conrad's turn in luck was due to far more than the death of the ship's captain. Aunt Marguerite had, with Conrad's permission, used her considerable influence on several important men involved in the colonization effort, including Theiss. After signing with Theiss, Conrad headed for a French port, from which he shipped for Boma, the main port of entry to the Congo. Conrad wrote letters back to Marguerite Porodowska, so we have a fair idea of what his journey to the heart of the hot Congo was like, or at least the first easiest part of his journey. He was working on Elmeyer's Folly and thinking constantly of his aunt, who seems to have been not only a mother figure but also a woman whose image raised romantic possibilities in his mind. "You have endowed my life with new interest, new affection," he tells her in a letter mailed from Libreville, Carl 285. Conrad arrived at his destination on June 12th, after an interminable seeming sea voyage down the African coast. The trips from Bordeaux to Boma on the Ville de Massio had taken more than a month. 40 miles from Boma, in Matadi, Conrad met Roger Casement, who had come to the Congo Free State thinking that he would abolish the slave trade carried on by the Arabs in the area and establish a railway that would link the coastal region with Stanley, now Malebo, Pool, where the Congo River becomes navigable and stays navigable all the way inland to Stanley, Bioma Falls. When he met Conrad in the spring of 1890, Casement was beginning the railway project, as yet unaware, like Conrad, that many of King Leopold's men were using the natives as slave labor. Conrad shared a room with Casement for almost a month, at the end of which he began the overland journey made arduous by the lack of a railway and fresh water, and by the presence of what turned out to be 3 virtual plagues: heat, mosquitoes, and one of Leopold's agents, Prosper Haru. The trip to Stanley Pool had to be made by foot. "Not an ass here," Conrad joked in a letter to Marguerite, "except your very humble servant, Carl 289. But there were other things to see along the way, not beast of burden, but evidence that men and women were being treated worse than animals." Conrad kept a diary in which he recorded these sights and sounds. Saw at a camp place the dead body of a Bakongo. Shot. Horrid smell. July 3rd. Saw another dead body lying on the path in an attitude of meditative repose. At night, when the moon rose, heard shouts and drumming in distant villages. Passed a bad night. July 4th. Agent Haru apparently passed a worse one. H. lame and not in very good form. Conrad wrote in his diary on July 25th. Passed a skeleton tied up to a post. Conrad was to write some days later. Put Harrow in hammock. Carl, 290-92. Harrow's crippling lameness made the trip more difficult for everyone, but it was far from the most disappointing development to try Conrad's spirits during the 36-day trip that ended on August 2nd. On July 29th, Conrad met a man named Lowett who was transporting another sick agent back in the direction of Boma. From Lowett, Conrad learned that the steamer he had been hired to command now lay sunk on the bottom of the river. Having come all the way from Belgium to captain the Florida, Conrad suddenly learned that he would be shipping upriver not as a captain, but as a sailor on the Roi de Belgies. Rather miraculously, Conrad had continually been writing Almayer's Folly while making the tortuous overland trek. Although work had proceeded fitfully, something definite had been accomplished. The loss of a command was a serious blow to Conrad, and may have made him prefer the slow progress of writing to the unpredictable vagaries besetting a would-be captain. Certainly the period commencing just before Conrad's arrival at Kinshasa marked the beginning of a period of disillusionment. With Africa, with life on the deck, with colonial trade, and with white European agents running training stations throughout the Congo. Conrad seems to have particularly disliked Camille Del Commune, the manager of the station at Kinshasa, whom he later called a common ivory dealer with base instincts. Carl, 294, in brackets. To Conrad's dismay, Del Commune decided to make the trip on the Roi de Belgies all the way to the inner station at Stanley Falls, where an agent named Klein lay desperately ill. That 4-week trip and the return downriver to Kinshasa with the corpse of Klein seem not only to have cured Conrad's weakness for life aboard ship, but also to have very nearly robbed him of all taste for life in general. Everything here is repellent to me, he wrote to Marguerite once the round trip had been completed. Men and things, but above all men. Carl, 294, in brackets. Conrad, who wished to leave Africa as quickly as possible, got out of his contract with the Société Anonyme Belge pour le Commerce du Haut-Congo. A terrible case of dysentery that he had picked up on his journey turned out to be an adequate excuse. Perhaps fearing that it wouldn't be adequate, Conrad had written Brussels to ask Marguerite to inform Albert Theiss that the society had failed to live up to its terms. A command had been promised, whereas in fact Conrad had served only as mate, except for a brief period during the return trip when Captain L.R. Koch was given sicker than Conrad was. What Conrad couldn't wriggle out of was his Congo experience. It seems to permeate Heart of Darkness, even though the novel wasn't began for almost a decade following its author's departure from Africa. Some of the parallels between Heart of Darkness and Conrad's Congo adventure are so obvious that it may be tempted to think of the novel as a thinly veiled autobiography. It may be tempting, but it may be also treacherous, for reasons that have perhaps been best articulated by formalist critics. A work of art, formalists would argue, is not undigested experience. Rather, it is characterized by form. That characteristic form is to be discovered by finding the patterns and relationships that exist within the work itself, not the connections that may seem to exist between the work and its author's life story. Still, even formalists would not have us be unaware of those connections. For one thing, we have to know that connections exist before we can affirm or deny their ultimate significance. For another, knowing the biographical background of a text helps us to better appreciate the text's difference. That is, the shape it has been given by the artist's imagination. And there is still another reason to become aware of the parallels between Conrad's Congo experience and Marlowe's. With such an awareness comes the possibility of deciding that the formalist view is too narrow, too limiting. To summarize the parallels briefly, Marlowe, the novel's protagonist and narrator, tells his listeners about his childhood passion for maps and about his declared intention to go someday to the blank heart of Africa. He describes how years later he signed up for a Congo command in the office of a great man, pale plumpness in a frock coat, after receiving some behind-the-scenes help from an aunt, a dear enthusiastic soul, whereas Conrad got his command due to the death of a captain named Fresselben. Marlowe is signed on shortly after the demise of the unlikely Captain Fresselben. Marlowe's description of his sea voyage down the African coast, every day looked the same, in brackets, reads like Conrad's diary, and his description of an overland journey from a company station not far from the African coast to the central station repeats many of Conrad's experiences in traveling from Matadi to Kinshasa by Stanley Pool. Heat and mosquitoes and the lack of water are mentioned, as is a white companion, who becomes so sick with fever that he has to be carried in a hammock slung under a pole. A corpse like the one Conrad was shocked to see while on the overland trek turns up in Heart of Darkness. Can't say I saw any road or any upkeep, Marlowe recalls, unless the body of a middle-aged Negro with a bullet hole in his forehead, upon which I absolutely stumbled, may be considered as a permanent improvement. Marlowe, like Conrad, learns that an accident has befallen the steamer that he has to have commanded. Like Conrad, he journeys upriver to retrieve a sick agent who dies on board shortly after being rescued. And Marlowe is accompanied on his travels by a man who must have been modeled on Camille Delcommune, the station manager at Kinshasa, whom Conrad referred to as a common ivory dealer with base instincts. Marlowe calls the manager of the central station, who accompanies him upriver to the inner station, a common trader with no learning and no intelligence. But the differences between Conrad's experiences and those of Charlie Marlowe are as striking as the similarities. To begin with, there is a matter of Marlowe himself, a thoroughly English everyman, not a Polish intellectual, who happens to be a sailor too. Marlowe is a recognizable kind of guy, one perfectly capable of joking that a corpse may be a road improvement, and one more than a little uncomfortable by the efforts made in his behalf by his aunt. "Would you believe it?" he asked the other men listening to his story. "I, Charlie Marlowe, set the woman to work to get a job." Other differences abound. The great man who hires Marlowe is not named Theiss. In fact, no names are given for Marlowe's aunt, the station manager modeled on the de la Commune, or the white companion who becomes sick and has to be carried, much as Prosper Harlow became lame and unable to walk. The ship Marlowe travels upriver on is left similarly unnamed, as is the company that Conrad knew as the Société Anonyme Belge pour le Commerce du Haut Congo. No character in the novel bears more than a passing resemblance to Roger Casement, whom Conrad stayed with Matadi, whereas Conrad didn't get to captain a ship thanks to the damage done to his intended vessel. Marlowe waits months for rivets and repairs that eventually allow him to command his steamboat. Marlowe retrieves Kurtz only to have him die on his ship. Anton Klein was the name of the agent who died on Conrad's ship. But whereas all we know about Klein is that he had fallen ill near Stanley Falls, Kurtz is a marvelously mysterious, imaginative creation, a kind of everyman like Marlowe. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz, Marlowe says, when the matter of his lineage comes up, but a mythological demon figure as well. Critics have often compared him to Faust and to Satan. Kurtz is, then, someone who exceeds the dimensions of anyone Conrad met in the Congo, just as the Africa in Heart of Darkness is far more than a continent. It has universal dimensions. There are minor characters, too, who testify to Conrad's ability not just to transcribe reality, but to invent a world full of powerful significances. In the area that corresponds to the place where Conrad met Casement, Marlowe meets a wonderfully sleazy accountant whom he describes as a hairdresser's dummy. There is a station manager modeled after de Commune, but his agent, characterized as a papier-mâché Mephistopheles, seems to be pure invention. Even more fascinating is the Russian mindlessly loyal to the murderous Kurtz, a harlequin figure covered with patches all over, with bright patches, blue, red, and yellow, patches on the back, patches on the front, patches on elbows, on knees, colored binding around his jacket, scarlet edged at the bottom of his trousers. These characters are not part of any diary or historical record. Rather, they are masterful touches in a great work of novelistic art. Note all of the artfulness of Heart of Darkness is to be found in its characters. Part of the creative complexity of the work lies in the form Conrad's narrative takes, that is to say, in the way the story is told. After all, we are not told the tale of a trip to Africa by an omniscient, authorial narrator. Instead, we find ourselves reading a story within a story. We must learn about Kurtz and the Harlequin, the hairdresser's dummy, and the El Dorado explorers from a nameless, anonymous source, a man who repeats the tale he says Charlie Marlowe told him and 4 other men one night sitting on a cruising yawl anchored in the Thames River. Thus, part of the meaning of the story is the way we learn about reality, through other people's accounts of it, many of which are themselves twice-told tales. Part of the meaning of the novel, too, is the possibly unreliable nature of our teachers. Marlowe is the source of our story, but he is also a character within the story we read, and a flawed one at that. Marlowe's macho comments about women and his insensitive reaction to the dead Negro with a bullet hole in his forehead cause us to refocus our critical attention, to shift it from the story being retold to the storyteller, whose supposedly autobiographical yarn is being repeated. Because we occasionally judge Marlowe negatively, we find ourselves having to take certain passages ironically, and the ironic distance that we experience between ourselves and our narrator is another important difference between a novel like Heart of Darkness and a diary or a history book. Irony, after all, makes possible a complex form of humor in which we find ourselves laughing at as well as with the chronicler. It is irony, too, that causes us to apprehend something profound about the human self, namely its capacity to understand or see through others while remaining self-destructively ignorant about its own identity. We see what Marlowe shows us, but we also see Marlowe, and one of the things about him we can see in his blindness to his own nature. Marlowe interrupts the story he tells to the lawyer, the accountant, the chief of companies, and the person who retells his story, to put it this way. Of course, in this you fellows see more than I could then. You see me, whom you know. What he fails to mention is that his listeners see different things, for the Marlowe known to each of them is surely different from the one known to all the others. We, as readers, enjoy the same privilege, and suffer the same predicament, as Marlowe's auditors. What we see in the story depends on the nature and extent of our knowledge. Knowledge of Conrad's life may lead us to see Marlowe's story as Conrad's own. Further knowledge of formalist theory, for instance, may cause us to decide that Marlowe is, after all, an artificial construct, a narrator, and an unreliable one at that. But there is still more to know about Conrad and his times. For example, the kind of knowledge that psychoanalytic, feminist, and new historicist critics would bring to bear. And there is more, too, to see in literary art than formalist theorists have seen in it. Deconstructors, for instance, would make us aware not of the definite form of a text, but rather of its surprisingly contradictory elements. Reader response critics might argue that a work of art is what we make of it. Each of these ways of knowing, which are explored in Part 2 of this edition, caused us to see more in Marlowe's story than the lawyer, the accountant, or the chief of companies did. Perhaps even more than Conrad did. But one thing is sure, each of these ways of knowing brings a different kind of light and color to Heart of Darkness. And then afterward to that introduction or biographical account, he lists the works cited: Burroughs' Guy, The Land of the Pygmies, London Pearson, 1898, Conrad Joseph, Geography and Some Explorers, Last Essays edition, Richard Curley, London, Denton, 1926. Some Reminiscences, London, Eveleigh Nash, 1912. Hennessy Maurice, Congo, A Brief History and Appraisal, New York, Praeger, 1961. Carl Frederick, Joseph Conrad, The Three Lives, New York, Farrar, 1979.